challenge him for the Democratic nomination. That's almost unheard of. Normally, if the incumbent wants to run, nobody gets in their way. Anybody run against Barack Obama when he went for his second term? No. Anybody run against Bill Clinton when he went for his second term? They don't do that. That doesn't happen unless you're awful. Okay? I don't know if it's ever happened since. Well, the first person that challenged President Johnson for the Democratic Party nomination in the election of 1968 was Senator Eugene McCarthy, this fellow right here. Senator Eugene McCarthy of Minnesota. So Johnson is facing a challenge for his own nomination for re-election. That gives you a sense that maybe people aren't happy with you, and people even within your own party. So Senator Eugene McCarthy of Minnesota decided to challenge President Johnson for the Democratic Party nomination for the upcoming election of 1968. It'd be pretty easy for him to run. What platform is he going to run on? Huh? Yeah, he's against the Vietnam. I mean, how easy? This would be the easiest campaign you could ever run. I'm going to oppose every policy that President Johnson has concerning the Vietnam War. That's all you'd have to say. That's all you'd have to say. So McCarthy opposes all policies Johnson had concerning the Vietnam War. He doesn't oppose his civil rights legislation. He doesn't oppose his Great Society. All he has to do is say, I'm totally against the Vietnam War. Now, I was talking with Alex this morning. That's the problem she has with being with me second period. Mr. Vickers told me this morning in a staff meeting that he had gone to an advanced ed conference, and a guy that was very interested in social studies there was telling the group that the kids between the age of vote ready and 35 years old, only 10% in the nation vote between the first year you can vote and year 35. What do you think McCarthy gained by running and saying he was against the war? What type of people? Younger people. He really, the younger generation of Americans who probably didn't have much interest in it at the time, that maybe didn't vote in the election of 64 or 60, all of a sudden these younger generations get right behind McCarthy. He's going to have full support of the younger generation. You're going to see more people from the younger generation voting in this presidential election than ever before, without question. So McCarthy opposes all policies President Johnson enacted concerning the war, and he gains total support from the younger generation of America. So in the minds of the younger Americans, a vote for McCarthy was a vote against what? Not only Johnson, but the war. Perfect. Well, we have these primaries, just like you're seeing now, and McCarthy almost defeats Johnson in the New Hampshire primary. And that's like a big upset even to come close to an incumbent. So in the New Hampshire primary, McCarthy comes within just a smidge of beating the incumbent president in that first primary. Now, who's back in the back kind of checking all this out? Who's back in the back checking out McCarthy's success? Hasn't made any commitment, but he's thinking, I'm going to see how McCarthy does, and I'm going to see if I want to get involved. Robert Kennedy. So back in the background, kind of checking things out and keeping track of the successes of McCarthy, watching in the wings at McCarthy's success, is Robert Kennedy, who at this time has been elected as a United States Senator from New York. Okay, he resigned the Attorney Generalship shortly after his brother's assassination, went and moved to live in New York so he could gain what? Senate residency, so he could be eligible to run for the Senate. A lot of people didn't like that, but by God, he was a Kennedy and got elected. But there were people that were upset because he said, you're not from New York. He moved there after his resignation as Attorney General long enough to get residency so he could run, and was successful in winning the Senate seat from New York. So that's what he was serving as at the time. Well, after watching McCarthy and the impact he's making within the Democratic Party, on March 16, 1968, March 16, 1968, Senator Robert Kennedy of New York announced that he would be a Democratic candidate for the nomination for president, running against the incumbent and McCarthy. So on March 16th, Senator Robert Kennedy of New York announces his candidacy for the Democratic nomination for president. So at this point, Johnson's facing three real serious pressures. At this point, after March 16, 1968, Lyndon Johnson's got three serious pressures he's facing. What are they? You should know two of the three. Right, McCarthy and Kennedy are pushing him for the nomination. That's pressure. What's he still taking a lot of grief over? What part of it? Tet Offensive. So he's still getting tremendous pressure over the Tet Offensive. So he's getting pressure that people within his own party are running. He's also getting pressure from the Tet Offensive. The third would be interesting story, and this will be a little bit of a heartfelt story for me. General Westmoreland requested that Johnson give him an additional 206,000 troops to Vietnam. So he's got the pressure of people running against him, he's got the pressure of people upset over the Tet Offensive, and Westmoreland's wanting 206,000 more troops to be sent to Vietnam. How do you think that went? We already got 500,000 there, right? He wants 206,000 more. Well, I'm going to tell you a story. This is a really, it's in ways tough stories to tell you because it's kind of personal, but who does Johnson turn to get his advice to see if he should send the 206,000 troops? No? Who? Senator Mike Mansfield. He brings Senator Mike Mansfield in from Montana, and he asks him to come into the Oval Office, and he doesn't want he doesn't really want Mansfield's opinion so much. He wants his blessing. Does he not? He wants his advice. He's going to say, gee, Hoyt, Westmoreland's asking for 206,000 troops, and you know we need them. What do you think? Okay, so what's he's strongholding Senator Mansfield. Now Johnson's a big man, intimidating. Senator Mansfield, tall, skinny man, not very intimidating. So the president wants Senator Mansfield's blessing, and he wants his advice as long as it agrees with his advice on sending more troops to Vietnam. Now remember I told you that Senator Mansfield had already been to Vietnam, right? And he told President Kennedy, don't get troops in there, you'll never get them out, right? So his philosophy, of course, is we should have never done that. Well, when President Johnson asked Senator Mansfield of his opinion, Mike simply said, not one more troop committed. Not one more troop. I would not support one more troop committed. Because after his visit to Vietnam, he knew the war in Vietnam was one that could not be won, right? He said that during the Kennedy presidency. Okay? So when Johnson asked him his opinion, he says, not one more troop. Now this story, I wish to God that this man was still alive. Here's a guy who should have lived forever. I mean, he was an incredible man. I wish you could have heard him tell the story, because the kids that I've taken to D.C. that have had the opportunity to have him tell, it's much better than mine. Johnson was very disappointed in Mansfield's answer, not one more troop, right? Disappointed. Mike isn't really interested in sitting there any longer. He gets up and starts to walk out of the Oval Office because he's done his duty. And this is what President Johnson says to him. You know, right down the line up here. Quote, I sure would appreciate some support from my majority leader. So Mansfield says, not another troop. Johnson's very disappointed, not real happy. Mike gets up, hey, he asked me and gave him his opinion. He starts walking out of the Oval Office, and Johnson says to Mansfield, quote, I sure would appreciate some support from my majority leader. Again, Mansfield, not a real boisterous man, not a real intimidating man, turns to probably the biggest intimidator in our American history as a president, and he says, quote, Mr. President, I'm not your majority leader, I'm the Senate's majority leader. Whoa! I mean, to say that to Lyndon Johnson, I wished he was alive to tell it out of his own mouth, because it's an incredible story. It gives me goosebumps today to think about when we were there and he would tell the kids that story. So again, Johnson was disappointed in Mansfield's answer, and as the majority leader departed the Oval Office, the president said, quote, I sure would appreciate some support from my majority leader. Mansfield turned quietly and replied to President Johnson, Mr. President, I'm not your majority leader, I'm the Senate's majority leader. Can you imagine that? I mean, maybe you can't, I just can't even imagine that. I just can't imagine that he would say that. Well, after Senator Mansfield left, Johnson made the decision that he was going to address the nation about the situation in Vietnam. Okay? He's going to address the nation. And he chooses to do so on March 31st, 1968. So after meeting with Senator Mansfield, Johnson decides to address the nation about the situation in Vietnam. And on March 31st, 1968, he addresses the nation at 9 p.m. And he stated the following. Number one, the United States would cut back the bombing of North Vietnam. First thing he stated was that the United States would cut back the bombing of North Vietnam. Remember, we were just bombing them into submission. So he said they were going to cut back the bombing of North Vietnam. The second thing he said to the American people is he said that the United States will call for peace negotiations to begin between North and South Vietnam. The United States would call for peace negotiations to begin between North and South Vietnam. What's he saying there? The best we're going to do is what? A tie, or what's the name for a tie? Stalemate. Best we're going to get is a tie. He's admitting that because he's going to try to get both governments from the North and the South together to start negotiating a way out of this thing. So the best we're getting is a tie. Third thing he said is what shocked the American people. And again, don't write it down, just listen. He said, with America's sons in the fields far away, with America's future under challenge right here at home, with our hopes and the world's hopes for peace and the balance every day, I do not believe that I should devote an hour or a day of my time to any personal partisan causes or any duties other than the awesome duties of this office, the presidency of your country. Accordingly, I shall not seek and will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president. How about that? So what has he done? He's done. The Vietnam War has totally consumed him and destroyed him. So this presidential election of '68 is going to be wide open. Now, here's the end of the story. The next day, new Secretary of Defense Clark Clifford made an announcement on behalf of President Johnson. The next day, on April 1st, the new Secretary of Defense Clark Clifford made an announcement on behalf of President Johnson. What do you think he publicly announced from the President? Think about what led to this whole thing. What did he tell the American people? That Westmoreland's request for 206,000 troops denied. Okay? So the next day, newly appointed Secretary of Defense Clark Clifford made the announcement that President Johnson had rejected the request from General Westmoreland for the additional 206,000 troops. And we'll finish with a few statistics here so you know. By that date of April 1st, in which Clark Clifford announced that they would not send more troops to Vietnam, you want to know what President Johnson's overall approval rating was? Keeping in mind that Clinton's was 74% after the Monica Lewinsky scandal. Johnson's 36%. That is horrible. That's a horrible rate. On that same date of April 1st, 1968, when Johnson's overall approval rating was 36%, on that same day, to that point, 21,119 American soldiers had been killed in Vietnam. 21,119 American soldiers had lost their life in the Vietnamese conflict. In the month of May alone, the next month, May of '68, just in that 1 month, 2,169 Americans were killed in the Vietnam War in 1 month. 2,169 in the month of May. In that same month of May 1968, in which 2,169 Americans were killed, peace talks began between North and South Vietnam. They began in May of 1968. You know when the Vietnam War ended? 1973. Those peace negotiations went on for 5 years. And what did we continue to do during those 5 years? Fight and then eventually withdraw. And we'll tell that story. So let me ask you a question. Who's going to inherit the rest of this mess after he goes out of office in '69? Nixon. Now I want to make a point before we quit. There are more names on the Vietnam Wall during Nixon's presidency than there are during Johnson's. Okay? So you keep that in mind. So we will continue tomorrow with the assassination of Robert Kennedy. What's that? Everybody, we'll continue tomorrow with Robert Kennedy's assassination. You guys that aren't here, we'll have to pick it up on the video, and we'll continue our schedule, okay? We all